Somewhere in an actual ledger, in the neat handwriting of a scribe, there is an entry showing payment to a man for wiping the King of England's behind. It's not a legend. A salary approved and filed away that remains legible 5 centuries later. That's what's unsettling about the most ridiculous job people have ever invented for one another. It almost never happened in secret. Someone paid for it, and someone recorded it. A grave robber who kept a small, neat journal of the corpses he unearthed. Another man hired to live in the garden of a wealthy family and pose as a heartbroken hermit. Even the word computer once referred to an exhausted human being with a pencil and a deadline. All these stories seem made up, but they left behind documents that you can hold in your hands today. A paycheck in an account book, a contract, a court record, a diary. Let's open 20 of those files and take a look at the most absurd and ridiculous jobs in history. Number 1. The man paid to wipe the king. Picture the worst job in a palace, and you will picture it wrong. In Tudor England, the servant who attended the king at his close stool, the padded box that served as a royal toilet, was not the lowest man in the building. He was one of the highest. The groom of the stool handled the king's body at its least dignified, and, through it, the king's secrets, because the one place a monarch could never perform in public happened to be the one place his most trusted servant stood right beside him. That intimacy was the whole point. The groom decided who was let into the private chambers and who was kept out, and over time he came to run the king's personal purse and much of his private household besides. Henry VIII's first groom, William Compton, spun that access into a fortune, gathering land, offices and leases worth something like £2,000 a year, the income of a great nobleman. And the proof of all of it is not palace gossip. It sits in the privy purse accounts, the household's own bookkeeping, where his wages and his name are entered in the same volumes that track the king's jewels and plate. The closer you stood to the royal chamber pot, the closer you stood to real power. Nobody at that court was laughing at the groom of the stool. They were competing to become him. Number 2. The grave robber who kept a diary. Here is a sentence that sounds invented. One of London's body snatchers kept a diary, and it survived. You would be right to assume that is a novelist's flourish rather than a fact. It is not. The manuscript is held today in the archives of the Royal College of Surgeons, and a man named Joseph Naples wrote it across 1811 and 1812. He had started out, fittingly, as a gravedigger, which taught him exactly where the fresh bodies were. The trade behind the diary was grim and simple. Corpses were worth good money to the anatomy schools, which needed bodies to teach on yet were legally allowed only the few cut down from the gallows. Demand ran far ahead of the hangman, so men like Naples dug. What makes the diary unforgettable is how ordinary it reads. Which graveyards the gang worked, how many things they lifted that night, what each one fetched, and the phase of the moon, because a dark sky was good for business. Between the entries he notes falling ill, going drinking, missing his family. In 1896, the college's own librarian published the whole thing. A job so illegal it dared not put a name on paper ended up, in the end, preserved forever as paper. One modern historian called it, flatly, the most revealing account of the body-snatching trade that still exists. Hold on to that image of a working diary. We close this entire list with another one. Number 3. The man whose whole job was plucking armpits. Rome. 1st century. If you rented rooms above a public bathhouse, you did not sleep. And we know this because the philosopher Seneca, trying to study over the racket, complained about it in writing. In a letter numbered 56, of all the noises he catalogued, he singled out one worker in particular, the armpit plucker. Fashionable Romans wanted their underarms smooth and hairless, so the baths kept a man who yanked the hair out by hand, one wincing customer at a time. Seneca's real grievance was not even the plucking, it was the marketing. The plucker paced the corridors, shrieking his own name in a high, thin voice to drum up custom, and he only fell silent, Seneca noted with visible relief, when he was busy making a client yell instead. Archaeologists have since dug up the little bronze tweezers that Romans used for exactly this, so the tools outlasted the trade as well. It is one of the oldest recorded noise complaints on Earth. 2,000 years later, the empire is dust and the baths are ruins, and yet we still have the precise sound that wrecked a Stoic's afternoon, a man screaming about armpits for money. Wealthy men and women alike lined up to be plucked, because smooth skin was a mark of status and the pain was simply the price of belonging. Keep that bathhouse in your ear. We come back to the very same empire for a far more dangerous job. Number 4. The people who were called computers. The word did not always mean a machine. For most of its history, a computer was a person, usually tired, often underpaid, doing arithmetic by hand until the numbers came out right. In 1767, the British government began printing the Nautical Almanac, the book of star and moon tables that let a captain fix his longitude at sea and not run his ship onto rocks in the dark. Every single figure in it was worked out by a scattered network of ordinary people sitting at their own kitchen tables across England, paid by the piece, each calculation quietly checked against a second worker to catch mistakes. Neville Maskelyne, the astronomer royal, ran the whole operation from Greenwich by post, keeping notes on who was late, who was careless, and who could be trusted with the hardest tables. One of his computers, Mary Edwards, did the work for decades and kept her family afloat on it after her husband died. The names, the errors, the pay, and the missed deadlines all survive in the observatory's records, an office run entirely on letters and trust. At its peak, there were around 35 of these human computers scattered across the country, an invisible workforce doing the arithmetic that kept the Empire's ships off the rocks. So the next time you hear that a computer crashed, remember that the word once described a widow at a table, out of tea, rechecking the position of the moon by candlelight so that strangers at sea would live. Number 5. The farmer who ate the sins of the dead. In a quiet churchyard at Ratlinghope, in the hills of Shropshire, there is a grave that belongs to the last man of a vanished profession. Richard Munslow died in 1906, and as far as anyone can document, he was England's final sign-eater. The old belief ran like this: when a person died suddenly, with sins unconfessed, a sign-eater could be paid to take a simple meal, bread and ale, passed to him across the body itself, and in eating it he was thought to take the dead one's sins into himself, so the soul could pass on clean. The people who normally did this were desperate and poor, and they were shunned the instant the meal was over, forbidden to meet the family's eyes. Munslow was neither desperate nor poor. He was a respectable farmer, and he seems to have revived the old rite out of private grief after burying several of his own young children in a single terrible week. His grave is real, his dates are recorded in the parish, and in 2010 local people paid to restore the worn stone and held a small service in his memory. For most of its history, the church frowned on the whole practice, which is part of why so few of these people are named at all. Munslow is one of the vanishingly few we can still point to. Some jobs exist because the work simply needs doing. This one existed because grief needed somewhere to go, and for a while a kind man let it come to him. Number 6. The church officer who whipped dogs and woke the sleepers. Two of the strangest jobs in English church history were often held by the very same underpaid man, the dog whipper and the sluggard waker. Before the 19th century, stray dogs wandered freely into services and caused havoc, snatching at the communion bread and fighting in the aisles. So many parishes hired a man armed with a whip and a long pair of wooden tongs to seize the animals by the neck and haul them out. On a calmer Sunday, that same man had a quieter duty. He patrolled the pews, and when a worshipper nodded off during a long sermon, he rapped the dozing men smartly on the skull with a knobbed staff, and roused the sleeping women more gently, with a fox tail tied to the other end of it. We know the wages because the parishes wrote them straight into their accounts. At Claverley in Shropshire, a man named Richard Dovey left money in 1659 for precisely this: 8 shillings a year for a poor man to keep the dogs out and the congregation awake. Another church, over in Kent, paid its dog whipper in an acre of land. A few of the strange tools even survive. The old dog-whipping staves still kept in a handful of country churches like relics nobody could quite bring themselves to throw away. For centuries, in other words, getting smacked awake in church was simply a line in the parish budget. Quick one. While we are only about a third of the way in, of the jobs so far, which is the single one you flat out refuse to believe a real person was actually paid to do? Drop it in the comments before I get to the ones that are somehow worse. I genuinely want to know where your line is. Number 7. The man who drowned in the work. Medieval cities produced an ocean of human waste, and someone had to move it. That someone was the gong farmer, and the grim joke of the job is that it paid handsomely. Working only after dark, because no one wanted to see or smell him by day, he hauled the contents of the cesspits away by the cartload, and for that a gong farmer could out-earn a skilled carpenter, precisely because almost no one else on earth would go near it. The real danger was never the stench. It was the footing. In 1326, the London coroner's roll recorded the death of a man remembered as Richard the Raker, who fell through the rotted planks above his own cesspit and drowned in the very thing he had spent his whole life clearing away. That single dry official entry is the only reason we know his name at all. He made a good living from what the entire city wanted gone, and in the end what the entire city wanted gone is exactly what closed over his head. The pay was no accident either. Even the gong farmers who cleared the royal palace privies drew what amounted to danger money, 6pence a day, in an age when that was a good wage. Keep that medieval stench in mind for a few minutes. Several jobs from now, a Roman emperor is going to look at the same problem and find a way to sell it. Number 8. The woman who led a coronation, throwing flowers. What do you do about the smell of a packed crowd in an age long before deodorant? For an English coronation, the answer came with its own job title, the King's herb strewer. Her role was to walk out ahead of the royal procession, scattering herbs and flower petals along the route, half for the beauty of it, and half on the old, sincere theory that sweet-smelling plants held disease at bay. For the coronation of George IV in 1821, the post went to a family friend named Anne Fellows, who led the way toward Westminster Abbey in white satin and a scarlet mantle, a headdress of gold wheat and oak leaves, and 6 young attendants behind her, dropping flowers onto the very carpet the king would tread. This is not a costume drama invention. It sits in the coronation records, and, remarkably, the Fellows family still lays formal claim to the office to this day, even though no one has actually strewn a single petal in generations. Fellows was even given a gold badge and chain to wear for the day, the insignia of an office whose one real duty was to make the air smell a little sweeter. An entire ceremonial position, appointed and robed and provided for, existed for one reason: history had decided the monarchy ought to smell of roses. Number 9. The children who carried the gunpowder. On a fighting ship in the age of sail, the great guns swallowed gunpowder faster than grown men could safely carry it, so the Navy used children. They were called powder monkeys. Boys who ran cartridges of powder up from the magazine deep in the hull to the cannon above, through smoke and deafening noise, chosen because they were small and quick, and low enough to move where a man could not. You do not have to take any of this on faith. The muster books, the ship's own official crew lists, recorded these boys by name and by age, in ink. Aboard HMS Victory at Trafalgar there were dozens of boys, some no older than 12, a few of them younger still, and many had come off the streets of London by way of a charity that fed and placed destitute children. The pay was real, the risk was extremely real, and the records are exact enough that you can read a child's name written beside the year he was rated to a ship of the line. Some of the youngest were only 8 or 9 years old, sent to sea because a charity had nowhere else to put them, and the sea, at least, paid. We tend to remember Trafalgar as admirals and broadsides and signal flags. The paperwork remembers the boys who kept the guns fed. Number 10. The human alarm clocks. Before a cheap, reliable alarm clock existed, waking up in time for a factory shift was a genuine daily problem, and the solution was to pay a person to solve it for you. They were called knocker-uppers. Armed with a long pole, they moved house to house through the dark before dawn, tapping at the bedroom windows until the sleeper inside stirred, then walking on to the next name on the list, all for a few pennies a week. Some carried a soft hammer. One celebrated London knocker-upper, Mary Smith, fired dried peas up at the glass through a short tin tube. The reason we can be certain this was real, and not just a bit of nostalgic folklore, is that the job survived long enough to meet the camera. There are photographs from the 1920s and film from the 1940s showing knocker-uppers still at work in the north of England, poles raised to the upstairs windows in the grey morning light. One busy knocker-upper is said to have kept a round of some 95 houses, waking a whole small neighborhood single-handed before the sun came up. And the obvious question, who wakes the knocker-upper, apparently never had a satisfying answer. They simply got themselves up, every morning, before everyone else. That was the job. Halfway, 10 files down, 10 still to go. And if you have been quietly assuming they must have used up the worst of them by now, I would hold that thought. The back half is where the paperwork turns darker in a few places, and, in a couple of others, a good deal funnier. A Roman food taster who may have poisoned the very emperor he was hired to protect. A ruler who put a tax on pea and then out-argued his own son about it. And a man who was laughed out of every room he ever walked into, whose so-called stupid idea is the reason your drink is cold right now. If this is the kind of history that nobody ever handed you in school, this channel is more or less built for you. Subscribe, and the next one finds its way to you on its own. No daily flood of uploads, just more real documents, standing behind genuinely unreal jobs. Number 11. The taster who may have served the poison. Remember that shrieking Roman bathhouse a few minutes ago? Same empire, a far deadlier kind of employment. Near the top of Roman society, poisoning was a genuine occupational hazard, so an emperor kept a praegastator, a food taster who ate a portion of every dish before his master so much as touched it. If the taster kept breathing, the meal was safe. If he collapsed, dinner was over. It all sounds like a screenwriter's invention until you meet Helotus, taster to the Emperor Claudius, a man named directly by the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius. And here is the twist the sources themselves record. When Claudius died in the year 54, apparently from a dish of poisoned mushrooms, Helotus was among those later suspected of delivering the fatal dose. The man employed to shield the emperor from poison is the man the histories quietly point at for the poisoning. Stranger still, he was not quietly disappeared afterward. He kept his position and served on comfortably under the next regime. Tasting was never a perfect shield anyway. A slow poison could take hours to do its work, long after the taster had swallowed his bite and waved the dish safely through. A job whose entire reason for existing was loyalty unto death, held, it seems, by the prime suspect. Number 12. The man hired to be a sad hermit in your garden. In the 1700s, the most fashionable thing a wealthy English landowner could add to his grounds was not a fountain, or a maze, or a folly. It was a person. The ornamental hermit was a real man, taken on under contract to live in a purpose-built hut on the estate, grow his hair and his nails long, wear a coarse robe, and, now and then, be glimpsed by visiting guests looking soulfully wise among the trees. He was, in the plainest terms, a living garden gnome. The terms of employment could be genuinely startling. At some estates, a hermit who lasted the full 7 years, never once leaving the grounds and never once seen in ordinary clothes, stood to collect several £100s at the end of it, a small fortune for the age. We know the whole strange trade because newspapers advertised the posts and later reported on how they went. When Charles Hamilton wanted a hermit for his celebrated gardens at Painshill, the arrangement became famous partly because his chosen hermit lasted roughly 3 weeks before being discovered drinking in the local pub. The whole fad burned itself out within a couple of generations, which tells you roughly how many men could actually endure years of silence for money, however good the money was. You cannot, it seems, pay a man enough to be lonely on a fixed schedule. Number 13. The man paid to read aloud to factory workers. Roll a few hundred cigars a day, by hand, in near silence, and the mind goes numb. The rollers in the cigar factories of Cuba, and later of Tampa and Key West, found a strange cure for exactly that. From around 1865 they invented the fix themselves, and paid for it out of their own wages. They hired a lector, a reader. He sat on a raised chair set in the middle of the factory floor and read aloud all day long while everyone else rolled. The newspapers through the morning, then novels in the afternoon, Dumas and Tolstoy and Dickens, chapter after chapter, day after day. This was not the owner's idea, and it was certainly not charity. The rollers each handed over a small slice of their weekly pay and then voted, as a floor, on exactly what would be read to them. Over the years, the readings turned steadily more political. The workers educated themselves on hours they were technically being paid to work, and the owners began to notice a labor force that could suddenly argue about ideas. Those readings helped spark real strikes in 1920 and again in 1931. When factory owners later tried to silence the readers for good, the rollers walked off the floor rather than give them up. Here was a workforce so hungry for stories that it taxed itself to be read to, and quietly educated itself into a union. Number 14. The emperor who taxed urine. Remember the stench the gong farmers hauled off into the night? A Roman emperor looked at that same problem and saw, of all things, a revenue stream. Ancient Rome quite literally ran on urine. Collected from pots left on the street corners, it was rich in ammonia, which made it genuinely valuable to the launderers and tanners who used it to scour wool and cure leather. So, around the year 70, the Emperor Vespasian, rebuilding an empire that was flat broke, placed a tax on the stuff as it changed hands. His own son, Titus, found the whole idea disgusting and said as much to his face. According to the historian Suetonius, Vespasian's answer was to lift a single gold coin from the urine revenue up to his son's nose and ask whether it smelled bad. Titus had to admit that it did not. And yet, the emperor said, it comes from urine. That one exchange hardened into a proverb still quoted in Latin 2,000 years later, pecunia non olet, money does not stink. Rome never quite lived it down. To this day, a few old public urinals in France are still nicknamed Vespasiennes, a 2,000-year-old insult the emperor would probably have taken as a compliment. It may be the most cynical lesson in the whole history of business, and it is right there on the record, delivered by an emperor calmly holding a coin he had minted out of pee. Number 15. The professional fake mourners. The Victorians turned grief into an industry, and one of its stranger roles was the funeral mute. A mute was a man engaged by the undertaker to stand, silent and solemn, outside the house of the dead for hours, and then to walk at the very head of the funeral procession in deep black, bearing a tall staff wrapped in crepe. He had never met the deceased in life. He was paid, quite simply, to look heartbroken in public, professionally, on behalf of total strangers. We know precisely how the role worked because Charles Dickens dropped one into Oliver Twist in 1837, and because the trade left its own steady trail in the undertaker's bills. There was even a well-worn custom of plying the mutes with gin to keep them from freezing through those long hours of standing outside, which meant that the professional face of solemn public grief was, more often than not, quietly and thoroughly drunk. One writer of the age grumbled about the sheer cost of a respectable send-off, complaining that it now meant paying for kid gloves and gin for the mutes. Critics eventually rounded on the entire practice and branded the hired mourner the lowest of all hypocrites. Grief, it turned out, was one more thing the 19th century was perfectly willing to sell to you by the hour. Number 16. The people who fed leeches with their own legs. For most of the 1800s, doctors were fixated on bloodletting, and their instrument of choice was the medicinal leech. Someone had to go out and catch them, and the method was every bit as bad as it sounds. Leech gatherers, very often poor women, waded into cold marshes and stagnant bogs and used the best bait they had on hand, their own bare legs. They would stand in the shallows and simply wait, letting the leeches fasten on and drink their fill, then peel the swollen creatures off one by one and drop them into a pail to sell to the apothecaries. A skilled gatherer could take a few thousand in a single day, losing a fair share of her own blood in the process, and many suffered lasting harm from the constant bleeding and the infections that followed. The scale of it is recorded in the trade's own figures, and it was frankly staggering. Tens of millions of leeches shipped across borders every year to keep up with the demand. The hunt grew so relentless that the wild medicinal leech was pushed nearly to extinction across much of Europe. The medicine has faded, but the arithmetic remains. A whole branch of European medicine once began with a woman standing waist-deep in a swamp, being eaten on purpose, for wages. Number 17. The people who collected dog mess for a living. Victorian London had a job with a surprisingly delicate name, Pure Finder. The pure was simply a polite trade word for dog dung, and finding it was the entire occupation. The collectors, again very often women, worked the streets with a covered bucket, gathering dog mess by the handful, sometimes with a leather glove and, to save the glove, sometimes without one. As revolting as it sounds, it was a real skilled trade and it genuinely paid, because the tanneries down in Bermondsey depended on it completely. Dog dung was used to purify and soften the fine leather that became gentlemen's gloves and expensive bookbindings, which is the quiet, perfect irony sitting at the very heart of the whole thing. We know the trade in fine detail because the journalist Henry Mayhew interviewed these workers for his great survey of London's poor in 1851, and carefully set down their pay, their patch, and their real pride in the work they did. By his count, a few hundred finders worked the city at any one time, feeding dozens of tanyards strung along the river. A good pure finder could out-earn a common laborer. The soft leather gloves a gentleman peeled on at the opera had, at the very start of their life, passed through a bucket that somebody had filled by hand. Number 18. The ale taster and the legend of the leather trousers. Long before any laboratory could certify a pint, English towns appointed an official to guarantee it, the ale conner, or ale taster, whose job was to sample the beer and the bread sold in the market and to report anyone caught cheating on strength, measure, or price. It was a real civic office, written plainly into the borough records. In Stratford-upon-Avon in 1566, the man appointed to the post of ale taster was John Shakespeare, William's own father. Now, here is where you should feel a small flicker of doubt, because the most repeated version of this job is very probably a myth. The famous story claims the ale conner tested a brew by pouring a little of it onto a wooden bench, sitting down in it while wearing leather trousers for half an hour, and then judging the ale by whether or not he stuck to the seat when he stood up. It is a wonderful story. But historians can trace it no further back than a single book published in 1911, with no medieval evidence sitting underneath it at all. The office itself is real and thoroughly documented, real enough that a handful of English towns still appoint a ceremonial ale conner even today. The leather trouser test is almost certainly a tale that survived for one reason only, because we badly wanted it to be true. Number 19. The rat catcher who crowned himself royal. In the streets of Victorian London, a man in a homemade uniform was catching rats for a living and cheerfully telling everyone he did it for the Queen. Jack Black wore a scarlet waistcoat and a leather sash studded with cast-iron rats and the letters VR for Victoria Regina, and he billed himself loudly as rat catcher to Her Majesty. He was a genuine showman, famous for plunging a bare hand into a writhing cage of rats without once being bitten, and he even bred the odd-colored ones he caught into tame pets that he sold on to fashionable ladies. Henry Mayhew interviewed him in 1851, which is how we still have his own words and his self-styled royal branding down on the record. But here is the honest footnote worth adding. There is no actual evidence that the palace ever granted him a royal warrant at all. He appears to have simply promoted himself into the title and then played the part so completely that it stuck to him for good. His skill, at least, was never in doubt. By his own telling, he had been bitten so many times that his body had all but stopped reacting to it. Sometimes the document that survives is not proof that you truly held the job. It is proof that you were very, very good at claiming that you did. Number 20. The man the world called mad for selling ice. We opened this whole list with a grave robber who kept a diary. Let us end it with another diarist, one nearly everyone around him was completely certain was a fool. In 1805, a young Bostonian named Frederick Tudor wrote a business plan into a notebook he labeled his Ice House Diary. He was going to cut ice out of the frozen ponds of New England and sell it, of all places, in the tropics. People laughed openly in his face. Ice, they patiently pointed out, melts, and shipping it down to the Caribbean sounded a lot like shipping snowballs to the sun. His very first voyage lost money, and so did several of the voyages after it. He was mocked, he was jailed for debt, and he came within a breath of total ruin, but he kept stubbornly refining the method, packing the ice in sawdust to slow the melt and building better ice houses at the far end, and, crucially, he kept writing every bit of it down. 50 years on, the trade he had personally invented was moving well over 100,000 tons of ice a year to ports from Havana all the way to Calcutta. The diary that had recorded one ridiculous idea had recorded, in the end, the birth of the cold drink. He guarded the method so jealously that the diary even records the private glee he felt on hearing that a rival ship had gone down with its whole cargo, and every absurd job on this entire list shares exactly one thing with his. Somebody wrote it down, and the paper outlasted the laughter. So, 20 jobs, and not a single one of them a joke that somebody simply made up after the fact. A man paid to wipe a king, children who carried gunpowder into battle, a farmer who ate the sins of the dead. What binds all of them together is not that they were absurd, because plenty of absurd things vanish completely, without leaving a trace behind. What binds them is that each one left a receipt, a wage in a ledger, a name in a muster book, a bet scribbled into a diary, and every time, the receipt outlived the embarrassment. That is the real lesson buried down in the list. History is not only the story of great deeds and grand battles and famous speeches, it is whatever somebody, somewhere, bothered to write down and file away, however ridiculous it looked at the time, which is exactly why the surviving record so often turns out to be stranger than the legend we replaced it with. Next time, we go the other direction entirely. The jobs so dangerous or so secret that the people doing them tried hard to leave behind no paper at all and got caught anyway. Until then, pick the one job on this list you would have sworn blind was invented and tell me which one in the comments. Name it and say what convinced you. I read every single one,